to the principles in the bill.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party on the Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill. It's with great pleasure that I speak to this bill, which I think is an excellent bill. And I think the Minister of Finance should be congratulated for putting the bill together. It was great that we got rid of the spending caps, which was a silly ACT Party intervention into the debate, but now that sense has been seen, we've got rid of that one, and actually we've ended up with a good bill. So there's a lot of good things about this bill. So the first part is about being explicit about how fiscal policy settings will interact with monetary policy. Now, of course, this is something that's always been implicit, but putting it explicit into the Fiscal Responsibility Act seems to me into the Public Finance Act rather, seems to me a very responsible and sensible thing to do. I would argue, in fact, that those of us who are supportive of a capital gains tax, excluding the family home, we would have quite a bit to say about the way a capital gains tax could influence monetary policy and actually take some of the pressure off monetary policy in terms of trying to control housing asset bubbles in the future. And I'd be very interested to see Treasury's analysis, given that it's been supportive of a capital gains tax for a long time, in using this bill and the new requirements in this bill to look at the effect of a capital gains tax in the interaction between fiscal policy and monetary policy, because we believe, as Treasury does, that it's a very positive effect of a capital gains tax on that interaction. Another part of this bill is that the government must state how the government's fiscal policy will impact on present and future generations, expecting to take a 40-year perspective. I think this is a very healthy development for our democracy, and from the Green Party's point of view, we try to take a long-term intergenerational approach to policy. And so whether that's around climate change, a classic, if you like, environmental issue, but of course it's a highly economic issue and social issue as well, having the government required to take a 40-year view, to take a long-term intergenerational view, seems to me a very positive development. And I want to come back to that with regard to PPP shortly. I think the other part of it is, obviously they've included the principle around that tax revenue needs to be raised efficiently and fairly. The Minister of Finance made a point in his speech that clearly this is a subjective thing, what is efficient, what is fair. But I think he rightly made the point that the government will be required to explain what they think is efficient and what they think is fair in terms of raising revenue. And getting that on the record and getting it transparent, I think, is a positive thing. The next part of this bill is the retrospective or the looking back element. I think this is a very healthy development. Often we read the government statements and they cover the present and they have these projections, and the projections are always wonderful about how everything's going to get better. And so I think it's quite good that there's an element of looking back that will be required in the reporting elements around the budget. So having that backwards looking element, I think, is a very positive development, because it requires us, or the government rather, and Treasury to look at what it said it would do and then what it actually did, and hopefully to make some kind of assessment about how things worked, whether they worked well or whether they didn't. The other part of it is about instituting or formalising the government's investment statement. This was a great innovation by the current government and finance minister to put out the investment statement. I think obviously it was linked in part to the government's asset sale program, which we don't agree with, but the investment statement itself, I think, is a positive development in terms of reporting. So taken together, I think these are really good. This is a really good bill. Obviously, we still have a lot of criticism of some of the government strategy, and we would argue that they're not meeting, if you like, some of the good principles that are actually in this new bill. But nonetheless, in terms of a reporting requirement, it seems to me quite sensible. I want to talk a little bit about PPPs and debt and how they might be covered by this reporting requirement, because I think it's important. PPPs are a private-public partnership. And generally they involve, if we were to take, there's many variants, but if we were to look at motorways, the government's got a problem with motorways at the moment. It has this very extraordinarily large motorway building ambition, but the revenue source for that motorway building ambition is drying off because state highway volumes have remained flat now for over 5 years. So the government's problem is, how does it fund this? And now traditionally in the past it would have done it through debt. and there's a very clear way to record debt on the books, so we would have had a clear view of that. Now, the government's now exploring using PPPs, public-private partnerships. So essentially, if we were to look at a project, one of the motorway projects, so they would get a private corporation to build the project, and then the government would pay it a certain amount every year to run that highway for any number of years into the future. So essentially it becomes the government paying this private corporation this payment every year for many years. Now, what the government and Stephen Joyce's aim in this is to lock down, sign up contracts so that future governments can't stop these major motorway projects. That's the political ambition of the government. The government wants to lock any future government into large motorway projects, whether they support them or not. That's why they're going down the PPP route for a political reason. From the point of view of financial reason and related to this bill, it's to try to hide the cost. If the government had to go out and borrow a whole bunch of money to build these motorways, we could all point to the debt and say, hey, you've taken on this debt, there's a certain cost of servicing that debt. So what the government wants to do is sign a contract with a private provider, and then they build the motorway and the government pays them an income stream over 10 or 15 years further down the track. The question I have is, how will the government books treat these things? Because it seems to me that if you borrow money and then you pay it off over a certain period, you are effectively committing yourself to pay a certain amount of money every year for 15 or 20 years, whatever long it takes. And so if that's a debt track to pay for the motorway projects, compare that with a PPP, effectively it's the same thing. That is, the government is committed to paying a certain amount of money every year for a certain number of years. So it seems to me that if the government is going to be straightforward and honest in its reporting of these kind of PPP instruments, they should report them as a liability essentially on the government, because essentially the government has to pay these payments in PPP well into the future as if it was debt. So I will be very interested to see in Select Committee to explore how the government proposes to account for PPPs on the government books, and I'm not sure how this bill will affect that. I hope it will have a positive effect in the government being transparent that actually PPPs are effectively the same as taking on giant wads of debt. The other part of it that I think is kind of interesting, it's a very interesting bill, this one, is that this is like Treasury's redux against Labor about student loans and working for families payments, in a way. What Treasury liked about the last Labor government was it paid down debt. And it did it in a big way. It was hard to criticise it. National were totally wrong in all their criticisms of the last government in terms of paying down debt. The one great thing that the current government inherited from the last government, the positive thing, was around fiscal. The fiscal position gave them a lot of leeway. But what Treasury really hated was the working for families and the interest-free student loans. And the reason they hated it is it didn't appear on the books as debt, but effectively had kind of long-term fiscal impacts on the government books. And so what they're trying to do with this bill is to lock in some kind of accountability, or from their point of view, accountability for what are the long-term fiscal impacts of making decisions like interest-free student loans or working for families, and trying to make the government of the day account for those out years, very significant long-term effects of making decisions like interest-free student loans or working for families. Bill English kind of hinted at this in his speech, but he didn't want to say it explicitly. But there is an inherent criticism with Treasury about how, on the one hand, they liked the last Labor government because they were responsible on debt, but on the other hand, they made these commitments which, from Treasury's point of view, locked in future governments around this and the fiscal position going forward, and they want the accounts to reflect that. I think that's reasonable. I'm a supporter of these policies. I think it is reasonable that we need to factor in the long-term fiscal impact when we make decisions like that, because I do believe that responsible governments need to look at the impact of their decisions on future generations. And I wish that the current government would take this to heart in a lot of their decisions. For example, if we were to look at the current government's ETS decisions around the emissions trading scheme, they have very long-term and very, very significant fiscal impacts on the government. It's very hard that the Treasury's kind of struggled to account for them properly, but even the last round of changes, according to Treasury's own cabinet paper, cost $300 million. So the decisions that the government makes around climate change not only have very significant environmental and social effects in terms of the real world, they also have very significant fiscal effects going forward. And it will be very important to us to make sure that this bill and the existing arrangements properly account for the true fiscal impacts of decisions like the government's decision around climate change, because that has such enormously significant decisions. I'm also interested just the concern of Treasury about pro-cyclical fiscal policy. I'm also very interested to see what will be the matching side in terms of monetary policy. What are the macroprudential tools we'll introduce to prevent pro-cyclical monetary policy from the Reserve Bank side if we're going to be keeping a close eye on pro-cyclical fiscal policy? Because those two things do need to be aligned and matched together. But anyway, it's a good bill, and I look forward to the Select Committee hearings.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I only need make a brief contribution.